West Coast 2023 season was absolutely diabolical. Save for a few shining lights last year, it was one of the toughest seasons as an Eagles fan I've ever had to sit through. They won 3 games all year, they lost 5 games by 100 points. At times, we definitely became the joke of the competition, and so I do realize as we start this video, there are a lot more factors than just one singular thing that led us to finishing 18th last year. But when you analyze the stats, there is one single stat that stands well above the rest in how jarringly bad it is. In this video, we're going to talk about what that stat is, what exactly it means, how it came to become such a bad weakness for us, and ultimately, what it's going to take for us to overcome this weakness. Now, for those who managed to catch a lot of West Coast games last year, who can remember the ever so familiar feeling of just seeing the ball waltz out of the center clearance and directly into our defensive 50? The games that stand out to me were when we played Carlton, when we played Adelaide, and when we played Sydney. In fact, when we played Carlton twice. Even the Crows game in particular I want to isolate because if you remember as Eagles fans, our backline was completely decimated in that game. We had one tall defender, one recognised defender picked in that team in Rhett Bazzo. Jake Waterman was named at centre half back in that game and then he himself was laid out. But if you watch that game, it's not even the backline that led to us losing by 20 goals. Where Adelaide seriously kicked our asses in that game was actually in the middle of the ground. So the stat that I'm going to go through today is scores from stoppages. Now scores from stoppages does sound really specific, but we'll define it. It's when a side scores after moving the ball in an unbroken chain from a clearance. Pretty much the main other way to get scored against in a game of football is scores from turnover, and that's when there's an unbroken chain from a turnover. So let's talk about how jarring this statistic is, and you may have noticed it on the thumbnail, but if you didn't catch it, I will get it back up on the screen for you. It was posted somewhere, a ladder, where the overall scores from stoppages stats were posted, and each team has a differential. So at the top of the ladder, you got Carlton. They were the best team from scores from stoppages last year with plus 271 points. In second place, you got Collingwood, who obviously won the premiership at plus 198 points. Of course, we already know we suck. It doesn't really matter that we're not in the top 2, but let's go down to the bottom part of the ladder. In 17th place, North Melbourne had a differential of 177 points negatively. Now look at 18th, West Coast, minus 702. Look at that gap between us and the next worst side in the competition in this specific stat. That has got to be historic. So while a whole lot of things went wrong last year, this stat in particular is probably the biggest symptom of how bad we've gotten, more so than anything else. So the takeaway from this stat is that we are really bad at stopping the opposition from scoring every time there's a stoppage. And by stoppage, it's a ball up, it's a throw in, it's a center bounce. What this tells us is that our midfield is extremely leaky and gave the opposition way too many looks at it last year. So let's try and diagnose how exactly this problem got so bad. The truth is, it's kind of always been a relative weakness. The midfield in particular of this West Coast team has never been our strength since the glory days of Cousins, Judd and Kerr. Now I don't have all the stats in front of me, but I can say with full confidence that when we had a fit and firing Nick Nat Nui, tapping it down to our midfielders, generally this kind of papered over the cracks of what was a fairly weak midfield for a while. But even back then, even when we were a good team, and particularly afterwards, there was this very specific stat or measure that used to get associated with us quite a lot, and that is post-clearance contested possession differential. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what that is. So you understand what contested possessions are, right? There's contested and there's uncontested. An uncontested possession is when you gather a loose ball. A contested possession is when you go and win the ball in a contested situation. Other players are competing for that ball. What specifically we've been bad at for a while, and in particular in 2023, is not so much the actual clearance situation. We actually only ranked 3rd last for total clearances last year, which is an interesting stat and kind of contradicts this a little bit. How are we getting so badly scored against from stoppages, and yet we're actually not bad at winning clearances? One factor is that we're obviously not good at driving the ball inside 50s. So if we're not scoring freely from stoppages, obviously that differential is just going to get worse and worse and worse. But there's another key element to this, and that is that post-clearance contested differential. So what that means is after the clearance, that's where we're losing the contested ball. It's not literally when the ball's getting tapped down and we're fighting for that first possession. It's what happens after that. One of the biggest recent examples of this, and this is a 2021 example, is do you remember that horrific game where we had to play the Sydney Swans at GMHBA Stadium? This is the middle of 2021 during the COVID affected period. We lost that game by 92 points. I randomly found myself watching it last night. The crazy thing about that game was that we won the contested ball, if I'm not mistaken, or at least we broke even in that stat, which means when the ball was up for grabs in a clearance situation, we were okay. But once the ball spilled a little bit free, there was a couple of handballs outside of that contest. On the outside, we got absolutely annihilated. Now, we've never been good at this stat, but there's a few reasons we were good for a while there, well, for a long period, let's call it what it is. How we were were able to overcome this relative weakness was a few different factors. First of all, defensive structures. Generally speaking, we had good defenders, Shannon Hearn, good intercept players, quality tools in general. In particular, McGovern at his peak. There was also Nick Naitanui who would be able to tap it down into a running Luke Shuey who would go on and kick a goal. Like, how many times do you see that in a Nick Naitanui highlight reel? And there's also a healthy list to consider. When you factor in, we're not a great contested ball winning side to begin with. So it doesn't help that in particular, you take Luke Shuey out of this team for half a season. Elliot Yeo has not played more than half a season since he won back-to-back best and fairest 4 years ago. You take two of our best contested mids out of the game. Jeremy McGovern has also been made of glass the last 4 years, our best intercepting defender. And of course, Nick Naitanui missing. So we've had a weakness absolutely laid bare. On top of all the other injury issues, on top of the fact that our game style got outdated, we got badly exposed when it came to contested ball in the midfield. So the next question is, with that all being said, how do we fix it? I think the thing for me here is, I know that we're well and truly on our way to trying fixing this problem. It's clear in the recruiting. It's clear to listening to Adam Simpson talk about the contest side of things. The problem with it is it's going to take a while to fix. Now, it's often felt like in the past, when the Eagles didn't have Nick Naitanui tapping it down to them, giving him first look, particularly in his prime, it felt like the Eagles midfield didn't really know what to do. I don't think their stoppage setups and their general method at the contest was necessarily set up for a situation where we're probably going to lose the hit out. You could see tons of set plays executed where Nick Naitanui would be able to tap it into space and you'd be like, oh, that was clearly a set play. There is one exception to this. At the back end of 2018, somehow Nick Naitanui goes down with an ACL. The West Coast Eagles become one of the weaker contested ball sides in the competition. For the last 7 weeks of that season, which included finals, we became the second best contested team in the competition. Now, whether that was a strategic tweak that we made, whether it was a mindset shift, I don't have the answer for you right now. But outside of that 7 weeks, that wasn't really a strength of ours. But getting back to how we fix it, what has been clear with our recruiting strategy over the last couple of years is getting big-bodied, contested style midfielders that can thrive in a chaotic midfield contested situation. Look at Ruben Jinby, Elijah Hewitt. Look at Harley Reid. Now, you wouldn't say necessarily that Harley Reid is part of a recruiting strategy. We had pick one and he was the most obvious pick, but the attributes of all of these guys do suggest that the Eagles have this in mind, trying to recruit players with attributes that we've previously lacked because the game is moving that way. Even Campbell Chester I'll throw into this mix. As a guy that is drafted primarily to play on the outside, he is actually a pretty good contested player. So between Reid, Jinby, Hewitt and Chester, we've got 4 fast, big-bodied, athletic midfielders. That has been a far cry from when you look at drafts like 10 years ago and the sort of players we were picking up, your Liam Duggins, your Dom Sheeds. My theory here is that that is a clear directive to pick up players that are more suited to the modern game style. And it's almost like they've taken a leap out of Melbourne's premiership playbook. Look at midfielders like Clayton Oliver, Christian Petrarca. Obviously, we're trying to change in more than one respect. We're changing the way we move from back 50 to forward 50. But in my mind, the types of midfielders that we've been going for in drafts, as far as I'm concerned, has to be part of a clear directive. A new strategy, a new philosophy of recruiting. So I'm stoked about that, and I think it will lead to good things, but I will temper that optimism by saying that it's going to take some time. Now, I expect we'll improve in this stat, but to what extent we can improve on the stat relies a little bit on how much football can Elliot Yeo play in the midfield here? Because naturally, as a contested ball-winning midfielder, he goes a long way to improving our midfield. To what extent can Ruben Jinby really contribute for 23 rounds? In an ideal world, we're not relying on a second-year midfielder to provide that, but that's kind of the list position that we're in now. So, I feel like I'm borderline rambling at this point, but this is the stat we need to improve on above all else to become a good competitive team again. Does that happen this year? It relies on a few different variables. It's going to rely on some luck, maybe some players improving quicker than we expected. And the good thing is, in my opinion, I can already see the future version of this West Coast Eagles team, and that powerful midfield is going to be our absolute one-wood.